Chautauqua 2010 is brought to you by the Maryland Humanities Council, a private educational nonprofit organization that stimulates and promotes informed dialogue and civic engagement on issues critical to Marylanders.
Hello and welcome to Chautauqua. I'm Angela Rice Beamer here at the Germantown campus of Montgomery College. Chautauqua is a living history program where scholar actors portray famous and influential historical characters. This year's theme is Beyond Boundaries, and tonight's Chautauqua character expanded the boundaries for all of us. He was a man of trees and flowers, but also a sailor, a scientific farmer, and a journalist. He believed that cities should be built with nature and parks all around us. Someone once said of him that he built palace grounds for common people. He was America's foremost landscape architect, Frederick Law Olmsted, Sr.
Good evening. Fred Olmsted. I was born in Hartford on April 26th of 1822. My mother died tragically when I was only 4. My father was a dry goods salesman, and he owned his store, well off. He was the kindest man, as I looked back from years ahead, that there ever could have been. In the beginning, when I was a small boy, he'd take me out into the fields around our home. And then he took me on trips to northern New England, to the White Mountains, and to Niagara Falls. One evening when we were walking to the woods, it was late by the time we were getting back home. And it was dark so we could see the stars, and I watched my father look up, and he was pointing at one bright star, and I heard him say, "Our infinite love." And I knew he was speaking of my mother. My brother John was only 1 when our mother died. I used to take John on walks. In fact, one time we walked all the way to my mother's hometown in Cheshire to visit our uncle and the sister of our mother. Then there was my grandfather. He was a sea captain. Once when I was struggling and trying to understand what it was I was going to do in my life, I was lying down in front of the elm tree in front of our home, and my grandfather came up and he said, "Fred, what is it you're doing?" And I said, "Grandfather, I'm looking up at all the branches and all the different ways they're going, and I'm thinking about my life and wondering what is it that I'm going to do." Well, my grandfather looked down at me and said, "You know, Fred, I planted this tree, and it's the most important thing I ever did in my life." And that made a big impression on me. My schooling wasn't very much at all. I was sent away, probably because I wasn't getting along too well with my stepmother. My father sent me to a series of ministers, and they made me work hard, and I learned some things. But I was a mischievous sort of person who was telling stories once in a while when the minister was out, and he'd come into the room, and we'd be laughing, and he'd come over, and he'd hit me with the broom on the shoulders. And then when I was 14, I developed a very serious case of poisoned sumac. And the doctors were very worried, and they said Fred must rest his eyes. Told my father I couldn't continue to prepare for Yale. So it took almost a year for me to recover, and slowly I started to walk out into the woods, and I basically became a vagabond out there in the fields and climbing the hills and walking through the forests and along the streams. letting sort of nature be my teacher. At 18, my father got very concerned of what I might do. He knew of a dry goods store down there in Manhattan, New York. So he took me down. He set me up in a room over in Brooklyn. And I used to take the ferry across to this dry goods store. And I worked hard, and I got promotions. And soon I was working all day and then keeping the books half the night. And I forgot that what was I doing here? This wasn't going to be the life that I was thinking about, envisioning. I wanted to get back to the hills and the woods and the streams. The only thing I did recall was when I crossed the ferry and all those great sailing vessels there in the China trade, and I thought of my grandfather. But I went back to Hartford, and I began again walking and kept thinking about those sailing vessels. And I said to my father, do you think it would be possible to go out and to be on one of those ships? And my father said, I will see what I can do. I was successful in getting on the Ronaldson with Captain Fox. Well, a couple of things I learned. I learned first that I wasn't going to be much of a sailor because for about 3 weeks I was over the deck. The other thing that struck me was Captain Fox seemed to be a nice individual, but as the trip went on, he became more brutal in his language and actually more brutal in his physical attacks, because one time there was a young sailor who we knew hadn't stolen money, but he accused him. He got the first mate to hold him down, and he beat him. My first writing was named At Sea, and I wrote, what can atone for, what can retain, what can restore the humanity degraded by the brutal beating from a depraved tyrant? Well, I got back. When I landed in New York, I saw my father, and he looked right through me. He didn't recognize me. It took me about half a year to recover, and then I went down to Yale, where my brother had enrolled. And with John, I met some of his wonderful friends, one in particular. That was Charlie Brace. Later on, Charlie was able to create something that I thought was one of the most worthwhile projects in America. And that was the Children's Aid Society in New York City, where he'd take the kids off the streets and provide a home. Then there was Fred Kingsbury. Fred Kingsbury was sort of an insightful person, at least when he wrote to John and wrote this about me. He said, Fred is an enthusiastic type of individual. The world needs people like him. He'll fail at one thing, and then he'll move on and fail at something else, and then he'll move on to a third and fail at that. The rest of us would be blabbering and crying about the failure of the first. Well, it seemed that there at school, at Yale, there were two things that I began thinking about. One was, and most importantly, I was in love. Elizabeth Baldwin, Lizzie Baldwin, daughter of the governor, who was the most beautiful woman in Hartford, according to the other guys as well as myself. And she, unfortunately, didn't accept me. I thought it was probably because I wasn't at Yale. I had no schooling. But she gave me 3 gifts. One was, she said to me, Fred, you're a very bright man. You have a great intellect. And secondly, you have the capacity to do many things for our nation. And thirdly, she gave me this book, Ralph Waldo Emerson, essays like Self-Reliance. And that book stayed by the side of my bed for the rest of my life. The other romance that I turned to was farming. It became clear that farming was needed to take a change and develop scientific farming. So my father got a place for me up in New York, and Mr. Geddes, who was known throughout the Northeast as a good farmer. And then I heard about a farm for sale down there at Sachem Head, where the family vacationed. And I thought, that's exactly where I want to go. So my father purchased that farm for me. And I went down, and unfortunately, I hadn't really checked or had Mr. Geddes come down. I worked and I planted and cultivated, but the farm was used up. The ground was used up. The only thing I really did was I planted a couple of trees, and I had envisioned them around the farmhouse. Well, I read another advertisement for a farm down at Staten Island. So I sat down and I wrote to my father, "Dear Father, there's a farm on Staten Island that I think will be just perfect." Well, I went down there and I began to get very excited about farming because things were working. And not only were they working for myself after a couple of years, but people were coming to me and saying, "Mr. Olmsted, how do you do this? How is this working?" And I had developed different areas of the farm and fenced them in and protected them and put drainage in. And that's where I developed the word of communicativeness, that we should communicate across fences to other people who, yes, maybe we were in competition in a way, but if we were to have a civil society, we had to have a dialogue. And we developed the Staten Island Agricultural Society, and people were excited about it. Then one day, I heard that John and Charlie Brace were going to go to England. Well, John wasn't too well, and Father had already sent him to England. So I sat down and I wrote, "Dear Father, I think it's important that I go to England to learn about scientific farming in a greater degree from a different perspective." Oh, my kind and generous father agreed. So off to England we went. We landed in Liverpool, and we were getting something to eat, and evidently the man at the store overheard our conversation. And he said, "Boys, from the way you're talking, you want to go to this park." And I said, "Certainly we'll go." So he gave us directions and took us about half an hour to get there. And as I walked to the park, he told us that this was just a swampland and a lot of rocks. But there were these rolling hills now, and these weaving paths and a stream. This was of such beauty that it was so grasping. And I thought to myself, more importantly, look at the people. People from all over. This is a democratic park. And that got to me, and I went back and I wrote a book, Walks and Talks of an American Farmer in England. And at one point I wrote, "What artist so noble as he who with conceiving power and beauty sketches the outline and writes the colors and directs the shadows of a picture so great that nature will be employed upon it for generations." And I also wrote, "Dame Nature is a gentlewoman. No guide's fee will get you her attention, nor abrupt demand. Hardly will she bear questioning, nor the direct gaze into her beauty. Least of all, will her true nature be understood from the hurried gaze of the traveler. Always, we must quietly and patiently wait upon her." Well, I got back to the farm, and I was captivated, by this writing that it was going on. And the response And I asked Charlie Brace, what should I do? I mean, I want to start this, maybe some more writing. And Charlie said to me, well, I'll tell you what, Fred, New York Times, Mr. Raymond, editor, he's looking for someone who'll go south. And I said, well, that sounds like the job for me. So I went over, and Charlie Brace set up the appointment. I walked in, and Mr. Raymond said to me, well, we have a job. I said, I'll take it. Well, I did take it, and I went south 2 trips and wrote 3 books and wrote over 40 articles for the Times. And on the second trip, I took my brother, and we went all the way to Texas. Father and I thought it might be good for his health because he's having some problems, and we weren't sure what they were. He'd also married the woman on Staten Island who I thought was my sweetheart. But Mary was a vivacious person, and they were to have 3 children. So at this point, I said, well, he came back, and he wasn't feeling too well when we got back from that second trip. And I said, you know, there's opportunities in the publishing business for me, John, so would you stay on the farm and run the farm? And I looked around, and then there was this advertisement from Dix and Edwards. They wanted a partner. Well, there was one problem. It was going to cost $8,000 to be a partner. Dear Father. And once again, my generous father, he made it possible for me to become a member. And we published Thoreau, and we published Melville. And I was excited and said, we've got to get English authors. So they sent me to England, and I got some of the English authors that were going to get involved. And then one day, I got a letter from Mr. Dix. And it wrote, unfortunately, Fred, Mr. Edwards has embezzled our money. Damn! Well, what was I to do? I was finishing my 3rd book, Journey Through the Backcountry, and I was sitting at an inn in Connecticut, next to the sea. And an old friend, Charles Eliot, came up and, how are you doing? Charles, he said, I'm doing fine. And you? Well, I'm not doing too well right now. Well, you know what, Fred, he says to me, there's a job, superintendent of Central Park. I'll take it. It sounded to me like just the opportunity I was looking for. So he said, whoa, there's competition for this. So I went down to New York, and I got my literary friends together and had them write. But the word went out that Mr. Olmsted is a literary man. We want a practical man. Well, you know what happened on the vote? I won by 1 vote. And the deciding vote, Washington Irving, a literary man. So I said to myself, now's the chance to really go to work. This is what I've been waiting for. And for 4 years, I worked as hard as I probably for the rest of my life, but people said I worked day and night anyway for the rest of my life. But I had to prove myself at Central Park. So, day after day, I was up at dawn. I stayed up half the night till after midnight writing the plans for the foreman. First we had 500, then 1,000, then 2,000 workers out there. The one big problem was Mr. Green, the comptroller. He would not give the money that was necessary to make the park what it should be. And I felt we had to do it the right way. Well, it turned out that we made progress despite Mr. Green. And then one day, I got a letter from my father that John was not doing well at all. He'd gone to Europe with his wife. And then I got a letter from my brother John. Dear Fred, it appears as if we will not see each other ever again. I only have a few days left, says the doctor. The friendship we have had is as greatest that I possibly could have treasured so much. Say hello to the boys for me, and do not let Mary suffer when you are alive. Your dearest brother, John. Oh, what next? Calvert Vaux, good to see you. You say what? There's going to be a competition, a design competition for Central Park? Yes, I've convinced him, he tells me. And you want me? You think I can help you design the park? No, I'm the superintendent. I organize people. I bring people together. I get the work done. You really think I'm an artist? Well, then let's do it. So we, evenings for 4 months, worked constantly there, developing the plan for Central Park. There we had this great meadow called the Sheep Meadow, where you could look and see forever. And then there was a field where the young children could come and could play ball. And then there was a promenade with the elms that we could envision. And then the lake. And then on the hillside there, we would have thousands of rhododendrons and mountain laurel. And they said, what are you going to do with the transverse roads across the park? And we came up with the idea we would sink them. So when you're looking across the landscape, you did not see the carriages and the horses, but only far into the distance. And we won the competition. Well, things were going very well. Mary and the 3 children were on Staten Island, and I would visit them. And I sort of began to have some of the old feelings for Mary. And we got married there on June 13th of 1859. And about a year later, we had a child, our first child, a boy. And I wanted to take Mary out and show the park, and I thought, bring along the baby. So we were riding in the carriage, and I was explaining things, and then all of a sudden we came to an area where I'd wanted to plant trees, and Mr. Green had not provided the funding, and I hit the horse, and the horse went up, and I went down. Mary, save the baby. Save the baby, Mary. My leg felt it was broken many places. Well, I heard the doctor say when they got me to the house, well, we've got to amputate. And another doctor says if we amputate, he'll die. Well, finally, after a couple of days, they done some sort of operation where now one leg was 2 inches shorter than the other. And I lay there in bed, and I wanted to have people just pick me up, which I insisted they do, and strap me there on a cart with a horse so they could take me around and I could watch the work that was going on. And I did that for a long period of time. And in the morning, I'd meet with the foreman. And then in the evening, I'd get their reports, and I'd write the plans and the directions for the next day. Well, Mr. Green continued to tie my hands, and I threatened I would leave. Well, something happened in the country that was more important than Central Park. The nation was going to war. What could I do in my condition? I thought I would be good if I could be placed in charge of the training of the Negro after they were freed. I was convinced we would win. Well, a Reverend Billows had another job for me, Executive Secretary of the Sanitary Commission. And he said, this is a job for you. This is the group that will be privately funded. It'll be part of the government. And we will be able to go out and take care of the wounded and serve the dying. Well, I took the job. And they said I was going down to meet Mr. Lincoln. Well, that would be a rare privilege, certainly, to meet this man who certainly everybody was talking about, that he had a power about him, and that he clearly was one that was going to be able to save the Union. Well, we got down there, and I walked into the meeting with Mr. Lincoln. Quite frankly, I was not that impressed. Well, he seemed to gaze off as if he wasn't listening. And then I went to the first Battle of Bull Run after the people were coming back from Washington. And there, what did I behold but a group of just bedraggled troops that were all over the place. They were stumbling. There was no discipline. And I wrote to Mary and said, Mary, the one thing that the Sanitary Commission has to do is have some discipline. And it starts with the Surgeon General. And I wrote a letter. For better or worse, it got up to Lincoln. It is criminal weakness to instow the responsibilities of the Surgeon General onto a self-satisfied, supercilious, bigoted blockhead. Well, it made an impact, all right. However, it took about 3 months, and then we got the change. And then things from the top started to get into order. One of the most creative things I thought we did was when the transports, the hospital transports. And my idea was in the campaign of Richmond, we'd go down there, and we would have the ships, and then we could put the wounded on the ships. And we did just that. And in the evening, I would go up onto the deck, into the rooms where the wounded were, after midnight, and I'd spend hours there. And one nurse came up one time and said, Mr. Olmsted, why do you do this? I said, because this is the reason we're all here. These are the soldiers that are winning this war, I trust. For them, we owe a great debt, and I am doing my best to care for them. Well, the conflicts continued with people on the Sanitary Commission. I would draw up my plans, which I thought were organized. I'd spend all night practically. George Templeton Strong, the diarist from New York, wrote a very interesting thing about me. He said, Olmsted is the most unique specimen of humanity I ever laid my eyes on. He stays up all night, and then he goes to sleep on the couch, and then he wakes up and has a cup of black coffee and pickles for breakfast. Well, I was only trying to get the job done so that the Union would have strong forces. However, I was exhausted, as often I was in all my work, through all my years. And I became ill, and I knew I had to leave because I knew that they really, in part, didn't want me anymore. Now, what was I going to do? I received a letter from a Mr. Dana. He said that a group of business people had purchased the Mariposa gold mine in California, supposedly the largest gold mine in California. Well, that got my interest. And so I met with the group, and they said, Olmsted, we want you to direct this. So I talked with Mary, and I said, Mary, I think this is my great opportunity financially for you, for the family. I went out west, went to the gold mine, worked again half the evening, sometimes right through the night, writing the plans. And then I got another message from New York. The investors had been swindled. Well, one thing happened out west there in California. Person who I got to know said, take your horse and go camping for a while down the Merced River. And I went down the Merced River, and there went over a hill, and then all of a sudden in the distance I saw these great, great rock formations. And going further I saw these falls, magnificent falls. And then as I looked down in the valley, there was the meandering stream and beautiful flowers and delicate trees. Yosemite, Gloria in excelsis, I wrote back to Mary. What a magnificent land. This must be preserved for all people of America. And I was selected chairman of the commission, and I wrote a long report focusing on the philosophy and the practical reasons why we needed lands like this, saved by the nation for all people. Then one day Mary came running up to me, full of glee and joy, and I said, Mary, what is it? What is it? The Union has won. I said, Mary, get all the red, white, and blue we can and get the children and decorate our home. Well, a week later, Mary came, and I looked at her face, and she had tears. Mary, what is it? The president is dead. No. How I miscalculated on this, the wisest, smartest president we have ever had, who's brought our union together and saved it. But I know his spirit will continue. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Well, I still had a big problem personally. What was I going to do? I got a letter from Calvert Vaux, and Calvert Vaux said, come back to New York. I've got 400 acres of land in Brooklyn. And I did. And I went back, and we created Prospect Park. And I wrote in the report, the purpose of a park is to provide a feeling of relief for everyone who enters into it, an escape from the crowded and cramped conditions of the city streets. In other words, it is a sense of enhanced freedom for every person who enters this park. Well, we decided to create Olmsted and Vaux landscape architects. And soon we were getting calls from all over the nation. And I was going up to New England, to Maine and Massachusetts and Connecticut, and going out to Chicago, and going down even to the south, to Atlanta. And there was a conflict that developed, and Calvert Vaux, he wanted to just sort of stay more central in New York, and I said, no, the call is too great. We have a responsibility and duty to do to the nation to create these open, free spaces. So we split. Well, one of the first things I did was cross the border and went up to Canada, to Mount Royal, and worked there for 4 years, and then followed up for more to create a park in Montreal. Then I got word that my father was dying. And I went up and I sat with my father in his bed as he passed away. No kinder, gentler, generous person could have lived on the face of this earth, I said to myself. And then there were the children. The baby died 2 weeks after the accident. And I had another son that died shortly after birth. But on July 24th of 1870, a son was born, and I called him Theodore Perkins. But I called him Boy, around the house. Then, 4 years after his birth, I changed his name to Frederick Law Olmsted, Jr. Then the work in New York City became brutal. Tammany Hall wanted to do this and wanted to that, and even some of my friends wanted to put a museum into the center of Central Park. And I fought them tooth and nail. And I won the battles then. But H.H. Richardson, the great architect, wanted me to come to Boston. And I took him up on that and moved up to Boston. But I wrote a report, Spoils of the Park, in which at one point I stated, open space is the one thing you cannot get in buildings. Picturesqueness, you can get. Make your buildings as picturesque as they can be. That is the beauty of the city. On the other hand, the beauty of the park is of the fields and woods and green pastures beside the still waters. Well, all through the 80s, we carried on. I was called to California. I was called by Governor Stanford to design Stanford University. I was called to Biltmore, which became one of the most important projects for us. And Rick was growing up, and I sent him down there to learn because we'd created the Scientific School of Forestry. And Pinchot, I got to go down, and he became the father of forestry in America. However, there were conflicts at one time with Freddie Jr. He wrote to me and said, Dad, I don't think I can be a landscape architect. I wrote him a 10-page letter saying, you must be a landscape architect. And told him all the reasons why. This is the only thing I can bestow on you. This is my life, and this is the life for America. And there are people in different parts of America that need your help. I went to Baltimore, and I created one community there, Sudbury. But there are great people there, and I tell you, you could do a lot there in Baltimore and Maryland and many other states. He decided that, yes, he would. Then I got a letter that Charlie Brace had died. I was so shocked. The man who had the most worthwhile vocation. And I sat down, I wrote a 20-page letter to Elizabeth Baldwin Whitney. And I recalled all the great things that she had told me, and without her in my life, I doubt very much that I would have been successful. And I thanked her, and near the end of the letter, I wrote, I have sold being for doing. And then it seemed that I was losing the remembering names to a certain degree. So I said that, all right, I'll talk to Rick and I'll talk to John, the oldest brother who was now my partner, my adopted brother. So we tried to get a grasp on where things were. Then they sent me to England because they thought maybe a vacation would help out. I got to England. My mind at times was very clear, and I wrote letters back instructing the boys what they should be doing. Then Mary one day was looking at me, and I said, Mary, what is it? Tell me. Calvert Vaux is dead? How did he die? They say suicide? No. No. I've told them, without Calvert Vaux, I am nothing. How can this be? They have destroyed Calvert Vaux in New York. They ridiculed him. I told him he just shouldn't stay there in that brutal city. Now, and then I was so upset that Mary took me back to Boston and took me right up to Deer Isle with John and with Rick. They built a home for me there. But one day, yes, maybe I did beat the horse, and maybe I did beat the keeper of the horse. They took me back to Boston, but again, they didn't go to home and office. They took me out to McLean Hospital, and there I was at McLean. I'd walk day and night, sometimes across the fields. What was it I said in that final report in the big park, Franklin Park? Let it not be for use and delight at this time only, but let it be of such a work that our descendants will thank us for it. And someday men will say, this our fathers did for us. And then one dark evening, as I looked up, yes, mother, father, Brother John, I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling place is that of setting suns, and the broad sky, and the blue sea, and in the hearts of man. And therefore I am still a lover of the streams, and meadows, and woods, and hills, and mountains, and trees, and all that we behold on this green earth. Gloria in excelsis.
We've just seen a wonderful performance of Frederick Law Olmsted by Jerry Wright, and he's with me now. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Angela.
I want to ask you a few questions about the character, and then some about yourself and what you're doing and how you got into this process. But one of the quotes that you mentioned during your performance, it really struck me. I've been sold on being. I've sold being for doing.
Correct.
Did Olmsted get a chance before he declined? Did he get a chance to actually be? Did he ever get a chance to, because he worked so much?
I believe he was very self-critical, and he was being. He spent a lot of time with his children. It wasn't that he was away from home all the time. But he was so self-critical, he felt he should have been doing more with his children. He thought he should be going out in nature and sitting with nature. But he had so many demands on him to do projects. And each project he took so seriously that it was good for the nation. It was good for a private estate, but that was part of the nation. It was good for a community. So he was driven for his feeling of duty and the democratic way.
Did that come from his family upbringing, or what do you think? Was that something unique to him?
I think that his father, who was a gentle person, but he was very committed to the community. He was committed to his church. He was committed to community civic activities. So in a small way, each day his father was part of the community of Hartford. He was a responsible business person. And he cared, obviously, so much for Olmsted that he provided these different opportunities. He bought a farm, then he bought another farm. He paid for his trip to England. He paid the price of $8,000 so he could go into publishing. So he was encouraging and enabling Olmsted. And Olmsted, I think, felt such a responsibility from his father to produce, because he'd been given so much. But also, very important, the democratic notion that it's not just a materialistic world. He said to his friend Charlie Brace when he was in Germany, "Charlie, you must come back. We need thousands like you. Our country is being overrun by materialism."
The idea of melding democracy and the environment was important, and that was part of how he designed some of his work. Is that correct?
Absolutely. That's exactly correct. It was the whole idea that the park in the center of New York City, Central Park, was open for all people. And he actually said that sometimes it's in the summer when the poor people don't have a chance to go away, and there won't be as many carriages as are in the spring and the fall, that I went out and I put pamphlets out in the poor areas of the city so that they would have the same opportunities that the wealthy had. Because it's free. Open space is free.
Someone once said that he developed palace grounds for common people, and that sort of embraces that idea.
Absolutely. I think that's a perfect example.
He found healing in nature. I've been very curious. His father was very kind, but when he remarried, when the father remarried, he sent Frederick away. You mentioned in your performance that might have been because of a bit of friction with the stepmother.
Yes, that's correct. Yes, I think that the loss of his mother, I think, was immense. And I don't know whether he was cognizant of it as a young person, but clearly when he took his younger brother and they walked 16 miles to Cheshire, where their mother was born, it was like going someplace where the spiritual presence of their mother was, because that's where she lived and grew up.
Yeah. Yeah, he traveled a lot. He did much more, even around the United States, because he had so many projects in different states. Did he write a lot about that? I know he wrote about in England, or was he just working so much that he didn't get a chance to write a lot about it?
You're absolutely right that he was writing a lot. And of course, the first book, Walks and Talks of an American Farmer in England, that was the one that inspired him and inspired other people. And that's why Charlie Brace got him the job with the New York Times to go south. Then he wrote 3 books on the economic conditions of the slavery situation. He was not an abolitionist. He believed that somehow you had to provide economic opportunities when Negro people were going to be free. And that he strived to do. Because he had it wasn't just that he talked about things. Now, as far as the writing is concerned, he wrote his reports on these parks. Every park, he'd sit down sometimes all night writing the report for the park. So he didn't publish books after those on the South. He would write reports for city government, for private individuals, multitudes of reports for Stanford, Governor Stanford, when he went out there, multiple reports for George Vanderbilt. He was a writer, because he was trying to show these are the details that are necessary if I'm going to create a park that is acceptable to me and acceptable to you.
And because he wrote, we have those records to refer to, so it can be duplicated and expounded upon. Had he not written so much, there may have been a bit of a void, as with some other historical characters where they did what they did, but if we don't have a record, it's not, we don't particularly get the essence of what they were trying to do so that it could be done again, or, as I said, expounded.
Right, absolutely correct. I mean, this phrase, the genius of the place. I mean, like every place he went, he'd look out there and he says, and other people wouldn't see it. But see, he would look into what is the genius of this place. I'm not going to just start all over at tabula rasa and then build things. Every place, and of course my conviction is the phrase applies to each human being. There's a genius within everybody. And you've just got to find that, and that's what needs to be nurtured. Now for Olmsted, it was the landscape. That he would, and he'd change it, but there was something there that was natural as the foundation, literally at the roots of it.
When you're not doing Olmsted, I know that you have worked with homeless children. Tell us a little bit about some of that work you've done.
Well, this has been the heartbeat of my work for 52 years. And when I came to Boston, I was not sure what I wanted to do. But through a series of circumstances, I got involved in working with adolescent kids and was living with adolescent kids. And then I thought that what we needed were group homes in the city rather than the large institutional settings where kids were warehoused from the city. And they were not getting education. So the small group home that I've been involved with allows us to support the kid, get him up in the morning, go to the school. And I could tell story after story where kids never had that opportunity living with families who weren't able to get them up because they couldn't get themselves up. And this is one of the tragedies of our cities today. And it still exists. And because we haven't been able to get education into our city schools to the degree that it's needed. So this is the issue that I struggle now with, because I was trained in conservation and wildlife ecology, and conservation seems to me to be almost the number one, because if we don't do what Olmsted did, create open spaces, preserve open lands, where's our environment going today? But the inner city I still continue to work in, and I will not stop. I mean, there's just too much commitment. And I have kids come up and I don't recognize them. They're 55 years of age. Do you remember me, Jerry? I said, look at him. Give me just a first name, Jerome. The guy said, Jerome. I said, Jerome Frazier. You were in Dare School when Kennedy spoke. He says, that was me. We had 3 grads, and the headline in the paper was 3 grads, 1 speaker, a lot of class. So these are the things that to me are as heartwarming as if he'd graduated from Harvard. And I believe that we need to develop just a wealth of young adult, people of all ages, but our young people, a commitment for the democratic principle that the land belongs to everyone. We need to come in and share together, and we need to share our lives together so that kids in the city have the best resources, human and financial, in the schools.
It has to do with the communicativeness that Olmsted talked about. Could you expound upon that a little bit more? You mentioned it in your performance.
Yes, the communicativeness. I mean, he comes up with these wonderful words. You know, when I first started, communicativeness. Now, for myself, it's community caring. But I think communicativeness grabs you in a different way. If I say community caring, they've heard it so many times. But communicativeness was where he would reach out, and even though he was so opinionated that some people would say, whoa, but he'd always be interested in where the other person was, listening where there would be a common thread that they could work together on. And that he felt was communicativeness. And his unfinished project was going to be this great tome, this great book, Barbarism and Civilization. So that's an unending book that humanity will never finish, from my perspective, because there'll always be barbaric acts. Each of us will do unkind things in some way. But we need to be civilized so that the civilized always has the upper hand to keep us moving forward.
How do the humanities play into that? We don't have a lot of time left, but I wonder, how do the humanities play into sort of bringing civility, even through the information? For instance, even through what I have learned through Chautauqua, learning about the characters, the various historical characters that have come through Montgomery College. There's something to be shared. For instance, I've learned about civility, the democracy, the merging of the environment, the healing power of nature, by hearing what you have taught us about Olmsted. Do you have some comments about something?
Oh, yes, I'm very enthused about the Maryland Humanities Council and this project that's coming up to understand about how can we be more civilized in our discourse. And the humanities, I think, has terrific opportunity. I mean, it goes back to the Greek theater. You know, the theater, what do we go and what do we get out of the theater? Well, sometimes the theater, I think, can get more of a message to us than going to church. Because in church, it's sort of ritual sometimes. But in theater, it can break into the heart of us. And we can be, whoa, you know, that's who I am. Oh, wow. And so when we break down and can be accepting of ourselves for when we've strayed away from the path we would like to be on, then I think you can have humanity. And in art, in the theater, all these reading, literature, this is why this program that I understand is going to take place next year for the Maryland overall program, not just for Chautauqua, that this is going to be a terrific opportunity.
Yeah. What's next for you?
Well, I'll continue to do the work. I also have this vision of 2022 when Olmsted will have his 200th birthday. I've always tried to get people thinking about it. And I started, well, one celebration. Now I said, well, let's have 200. Now I think with all the way you can communicate these new ways that I don't use electronically, let's have 2,022 different celebrations in America that year. And so if we can get young people planting a tree and watch it grow over the next 12 years, I think that'd be an exciting project.
Very exciting. Very exciting. Well, I'm very, very glad that you brought Olmsted to us here at Montgomery College. And I hope that you get to the 2023 200th anniversary celebration and continued success in the other projects that you're doing. It's sort of a duty and a responsibility.
Duty and responsibility. Olmsted would be very pleased with the words you used.
Thank you, thank you. And thank you very much for joining us. You've been watching Chautauqua Beyond Boundaries from the Germantown campus of Montgomery College. I'm Angela Rice Beamer. Good night.